So I attended a women's college in New England during the 1980s. It was the fall of 1987, and I just transferred in as a sophomore. I lived on the top floor of an old, ivy-covered brick dormitory built in the mid-1800s. The building was beautiful, but you could feel every draft. You could smell the heat come on, the radiators clanged, and noise really traveled. I lived in room 417, which was located at the crux of an L-shaped hallway. And there were these very heavy swinging fire doors that separated my part of the hall, long hall, from short hall, where the bathroom was located. A few doors down in the other direction on short hall was this storage room with a boarded up staircase that led to a beautiful bell tower that was closed off to the public. I was a night owl, and my roommate often spent the night at her boyfriend's house. So I took advantage of having the room to myself and often hung out really late. So on this night, it was around 3 a.m., and I was finally getting ready to go to bed. So I passed through the fire doors on my way to the bathroom. And as I'm walking through, I noticed the reflection in the window of the fire door of a blonde girl standing behind me. So I turned as I held the door for her and went to say hello, but she was gone. I was startled, but continued on my way. So I went to the bathroom and I brushed my teeth, and all of a sudden I got really cold. And I turned to the right and looked into the hallway, and there was that girl again. But this time she was just hovering in the hallway. She had long blonde hair, and she wore this long, light pink nightgown. But her demeanor was really unsettling. She was hysterically upset and completely silent. And as I said, she just hovered in the doorway and held my gaze. And she had this terrified look in her eyes. And I wanted to help her. So I tried to ask her what was wrong, but the words just wouldn't come out of my mouth. And then poof, she just up and vanished. It was the strangest thing. I jumped down to the hallway to see where she went, and I saw no trace of her. But what was even more disturbing is that there was no sound whatsoever in this really old rickety building that was always loud. I heard no one's voice, no one's footsteps, no opening and closing of any of those heavy wooden dorm doors, not even those loud, creaking, swinging fire doors. It was really eerie, and I was really terrified, so I just went to bed. A few weeks later, I was in that same bathroom, and I heard this strange scraping noise coming from one of the 3 bathroom stalls. And I looked around, there was nobody there. It was weird, but I just went back to my room. So then a little while later, my roommate returned from the bathroom in a panic. And she said there was all these loud noises in the bathroom, and she couldn't explain what was going on, and I had to come back down with her. So I went down, and we're just hanging out, investigating the situation, and the scraping noise that I had heard earlier started up again. And it was coming from the middle stall. So I mustered up some courage, and I climbed up under the toilet seat in the adjacent stall and looked over the partition. And sure enough, the latch that closes the bathroom door was spinning a whole 360 degrees all by itself. It was inexplicable. So we hightailed it out of there and just ran into our rooms. And then we made a pact that night that we're not going to tell anybody what happened, because we were the new girls in the dorm and we did not want anyone to think that we were crazy. So several months later, we had a little dorm room party on our floor with some friends across the way from us and then some boys from a nearby school. I should probably mention that back in the 80s at our little women's college, they had a strict parietal policy that governed male visitors. So, in other words, if a guy came to visit us in our dorm, we had to check him in at the front desk, and he was signed in by a classmate who was on bell call. And then she would announce over the speakers that we had a gentleman caller in the parlor. So they'd come in for a couple hours, and then they had to be out by curfew, and we had to escort them out of the building. Or you could do what we did, which was we would just sneak them and stash them in a room upstairs when nobody was looking. So we had our gentlemen callers up in our room, and we were drinking beers and dancing and having a great time all night. But we had our own boyfriends, so we stashed these guys down into a vacant room, which was just a few doors down from mine, and that was in room 409, which was located 2 doors down a long hall across from the storage room that led to that bell tower. So an hour or so after we all went to bed, around 3 a.m., our gentlemen callers came screeching down to our room in panic. And we thought they were just joking around, but we quickly realized that they were absolutely terrified. And then they told us this crazy story. So they're all asleep on mattresses on the floor when this huge floor-to-ceiling cactus that somebody had left in the room fell over on top of them, waking them from pretty sound sleep. Or then all of a sudden, there was this scratching on the door, and the scratching got louder and louder, and then it turned into banging on the door. These guys were convinced that there was a ghost in this room, and honestly, I was pretty sure that they had seen a ghost as well. So come summer, I was really relieved to move out of that room and move out of the building entirely. So fast forward to my junior year, there was this really nice elderly man named Eddie who was a caretaker on campus. So one day, chatting with Eddie while he was doing his gardening, he told me the story of a young woman named Eve, who was a student at the school when it was still a seminary, and she was murdered. Eve was from a very affluent family, and she had struck up a romantic relationship with a local boy. And since they were from various different sort of social classes, their relationship would have been frowned upon. So they met up in the bell tower for a little late night rendezvous. And what the young man didn't know was that Eve's parents had promised her hand in marriage to a young man who was a student at an Ivy League school nearby. When Eve met up with her lover, and he discovered the truth about her plans to marry this other guy, he became so jealous and enraged, and he pushed her down the stairs. She was terribly injured, but she didn't die right away. She had been trying to get help for herself and was crawling out from the stairwell into the hallway and was scratching at the door and banging, trying to get help, but sadly died in the hallway right outside of dorm room 409 on the way down to her room, which was room 417.
I now live far away from the childhood home of which I am going to tell you about, but my family still owns the house. It sits abandoned and empty in the middle of its wooded lot, the scary house of the neighborhood. I return to the house once or twice a year to check on it. As I sit here in my old room, I can still feel the energy of this house. I would say that growing up here has made me sensitive. The result of living in a house with a negative energy so strong that nearly everyone who visits can feel it. The house is a large 2-story ranch that sits in the middle of 6 acres of woods and is set back several hundred feet from the road. In the summer, you can't even see the house from the street because of the overgrown trees and foliage hanging over the driveway like a dark tunnel. In the winter, The white facade of the house looks like a scary mask staring out through the tangle of bare trees. It's one of those houses that has a name because it seems to have its own spirit. Its name is Ledgeview. My family bought Ledgeview in the early 1990s. We moved when I was 6 years old. It was built hastily in the early 70s, and from the beginning, the upkeep of the place was a nightmare. There was always something broken that required attention, and it was hard to keep the house looking nice and welcoming. Inside, the house was arranged in a long line. At one end of the long upstairs hallway, and the bedrooms and bathroom at the other end. In the middle of this hallway, a staircase led to the lower level, which was arranged almost the same, except there was no kitchen downstairs, just a large, finished great room, and a long hallway with 4 rooms and a bathroom. The downstairs was where I felt most uneasy as a kid. Sometimes I would walk from my bedroom at one end of the long hallway upstairs, past the stairway to the kitchen for a nighttime drink. As I walked past the stairs, I could feel an intense, angry energy radiating from the basement. It felt like heat from a heat lamp shining on the side of my face as I walked by, though of course the house was completely dark. In the 12 years that I lived there, I never once looked downstairs when I felt that feeling, as I could just tell that I didn't want to see what was looking back up at me from the bottom of the dark stairwell. My computer desk was set up in the great room on the lower level, on the side of the room opposite the long hallway. Growing up in the early 2000s, I would spend hours and hours sitting at my computer, chatting with friends on instant messenger and browsing the internet. Every once in a while, I would start to feel the intense negative energy building like heat from a fire on my back. And sometimes it would be accompanied by a terrible smell like a dead, rotting animal. I could tell that it was coming from the long, dark hallway at the other end of the room. I would often sit there and try to ignore it, but the intensity would build and build until it was nearly unbearable, and I would have to get up and go upstairs. A few times I worked up the courage to walk over and look down the hallway. Usually, all 5 doors along the hallway were closed, and it felt like something evil was lurking behind one of them, but I could never tell which one. A few times, as I walked past that hallway on my way to the stairs, I caught a flash of movement down the darkened hallway. But when I looked back to see what it was, there was nothing there. When I was 15, my parents bought another, smaller house in a neighborhood on the other side of town. They kept Ledgeview because there were so many belongings and furniture stored there that it would never fit in the tiny new house. I chose to stay in my old room at Ledgeview rather than moving across town to the new house. This meant I spent many, many nights alone, and I had plenty of time to listen to the dead silence of the place. The house had radiant electric heating, which meant no furnace, no air vents, nothing to make the usual house sounds at night. Often I would invite my friends up to the house just to have some company, and they all sensed the darkness of the place as well. Many of them refused to stay over, and they had no problem telling me that was because Ledgeview was so eerie. One time I met up with several friends of mine at Ledgeview, and we all hopped in one car to go somewhere. When we returned, we pulled into the U-shaped driveway closest to the house, and we could see the darkened windows of the kitchen and the dining room. Every light in the house was off, and we just sat in the car for a while and chatted, because we knew no one else was inside the house. As we sat there, a light came on in the living room, and it shone through the kitchen window. Our conversation stopped. The light attracted our attention. As we stared in surprise at the dim light, a dark shadow passed between the lights and the window, like someone was walking down the long hallway inside the house. One of my friends said, "There's someone in your house." We immediately jumped out of the car and ran inside to confront the intruder. When we got inside, everything was dark and silent. Just the one light that we saw turn on in the living room. We searched the house room by room, turning on every light, checking inside every closet and under every bed. Some of my friends stood by the 2 doors, making sure no one could leave the house undetected. We all saw the shadow through the kitchen window, and we were certain that someone was hiding in the house. After going through every room and checking every single space in the house that a person could be hiding, we were baffled. I knew it had to be the house playing tricks on us. Sometimes I had parties at Ledgeview, and I would always invite my friends to stay over after the parties, and there was plenty of room in the house for them to crash. There were actually 2 living rooms upstairs with comfortable couches to sleep on. Right from the beginning, some guys refused to stay inside at all, opting instead to sleep in their cars in the driveway. There was one time when 2 of them decided to sleep on the couches in the living room closest to the stairs. They got comfortable, and I said goodnight and walked to my room at the end of the hallway. Several minutes after I settled into bed, I heard a commotion from the living room and the sounds of my friends talking excitedly. I got out of bed and walked over there to ask them what the matter was, and they said they heard a voice from the basement echo up the stairwell. They said it sounded electronic and childlike, like a doll that can talk. But they couldn't make out what it said. We went downstairs and looked around, and although there were some toys down there, they hadn't been disturbed, and we couldn't find any sort of talking doll or toy. They laid back down, now on edge and freaked out, and I went back to my room a few minutes later. I again heard them yelling excitedly, and when I asked them why, they said that they heard the voice again. We turned on all the lights upstairs and downstairs and searched everywhere for something that could be making that sound, but we found nothing. My friends opted to sleep in their car that night. Other things happened at Ledgeview, but the characteristic occurrence is that people just felt freaked out and unwelcomed at the house. Dogs would go crazy at the property, barking at nothing and clinging to their master's side when in the house. One time I left my dog in the room and went outside to look around and clean some things up. When I returned, I found my dog cowering under the kitchen table, and he had absolutely destroyed the door and door frame of my bedroom in order to get out of my room. He weighed 16 pounds and has never done anything like that before or since. I often wonder what he felt in that room that frightened him so badly. I moved out of Ledgeview to another state when I turned 18, leaving the house vacant and abandoned. I returned once or twice a year to grab some of my things, but no one has ever lived in the house full-time since then. About a decade after I moved, I was driving the car with my younger sister. She had lived at Ledgeview from the ages of 2 to about 14, and her room was in the middle of the long hallway, directly opposite the staircase to the lower level. Her door was positioned so that as soon as you opened it, you'd be looking directly down that staircase. We never really talked about how Ledgeview felt haunted before, but somehow it came up on that drive. My sister said that she had always felt the house's energy too, and that a couple of times growing up, she had opened her bedroom door at night to get a drink of water and saw something white and luminescent at the bottom of the stairs. It was usually shapeless like a cloud. However, there was one time when she thought she could make out the form of a little girl dressed in a white nightgown, just standing at the bottom of the stairs. I think that is exactly what I sensed as I walked past all of those times, never daring to look down and see what was there. In the years since I moved out, my family has been unable to sell the house, and it has sat vacant, except for its own energy, rotting and waiting to be torn down. Some people have toured the house in thoughts of buying it and renovating it. But I think they could sense the darkness of the place and left as quickly as they could.
This happened around early 2017. I was at a birthday party with a bunch of friends in the woods. We were out there for around 4 hours, and near the end of the party we all started hearing quiet voices all around us, including the opposite way of the entrance, coming from beyond the tree line in the pitch black. It was a remote opening near a single-lane dirt road that we had to drive out to, so there are no neighborhoods or houses anywhere near this area or the road in, as it is a national forest. We all had arrived during the daytime and no other cars were parked at the entrance, including when we left. There is a gate at the end of the dirt road that restricts car access beyond that point. We became extremely quiet and could hear whatever was out there whispering, and it sounded like it was over 20 different voices, so we panicked and we started to pack up. There were no lights anywhere around us, whoever they were standing in complete darkness, and had walked at least 12 miles from the other entrance. After we had quietly gotten the tables and chairs packed up, we went to leave and we heard a loud pop noise. And then another loud pop noise right after, as if something had been fired at us, and then the impact. We ran into our cars and sped away. I've talked about this several times with a few friends that were there, and we have no rational explanation for what happened. One of my friends, who was an avid hunter and hiker who had explored those woods thoroughly, was adamant that it made absolutely no sense that such a large number of people were in this area of the woods at that hour with no lights. Furthermore, he clarified that if they didn't park at the gate and walked from there, they would have had to have hiked a dozen miles to get to where we were, considering they seemed to have come from deeper in the woods than we were. I've never been back out there. I was traveling around Australia during my gap year at the time. It had always been a dream of mine to rent a camper van and drive the length and breadth of Gold Coast Road, and then head on down to Melbourne and back up to Adelaide. I was by myself, trying to fulfill that dream, and in spite of traveling solo, I never felt lonely. That's because I met a lot of fun people along the way. Each day was an adventure, and each night was a new party with new faces. Single-serving friends, as they said in Fight Club. House for one evening, and then you never see them again. But of all the people I met on that trip, two stick out like a sore thumb in my mind. It was during one of my final nights in the country. I was close to Adelaide at this point, and had just met a couple of guys called Dave and Jacko. They seemed like fun people, friendly and up for a good time. I spent the evening with them, drinking a few brews under the stars. As the evening drew to a close, I wished them both well, and said that if we didn't meet again, I hoped they'd both have nice lives. Since I was living out of my camper van to save money, I was sleeping in there too, so I hopped inside my vehicle, a little dizzy from the night's beverages, and fell asleep in the back almost immediately. I woke up in the middle of the night to rumbling and the sound of tires on dirt. My van's engine was roaring. Whilst I was sleeping in the back, someone had got their hands on my keys, and were now driving my vehicle to God knows where, with me still in the back. I started shouting, "Hey, stop!" But all I heard in reply was the laughter and hollering. It was a sound I'd heard earlier when I'd made Jacko laugh. Now I knew who was driving me. Question was, where was Jacko taking me? Looking out the window, I could see that there was another car following us. Behind the wheel was the other guy, Dave. What were these guys up to? I didn't want to find out, so I took out my phone to call for help. No signal. That's because we were long gone from civilization by that point. We were in the outback. Because of the partition between the front and rear of the van, I couldn't see or get to Jacko. I couldn't jump out of the back of the van either, given the speed at which we were moving, the fact that Dave was right behind us, and the fact that we were in the middle of nowhere. So I tried reasoning with Jacko, shouting for him to pull over. He ignored me. I don't know how long I was in the back wall before I woke up, how long this madman had been driving me, but eventually we came to a stop. Looking out the window, all I could see was desolation. Nothing for miles in any direction. The real Australian outback. Jacko jumped out of the vehicle and hopped into Dave's car. The pair of them circled my van, kicking up dust all around. I could hear them laughing and taunting me, saying things like, "Yeah, mate, have a nice life," as they drove off back the way that they had come and disappeared from my view. It's infamously perilous to travel into the outback. Without shade or supplies, most people don't last a day. The sun was rising, and it was set to be a scorching day. I was dehydrated from the night before, and there was only one small bottle of water in the back of the van. The van itself was almost out of gas. I had no phone signal. If I couldn't get a hold of anyone, I was dead. I had two choices: sit in my vehicle and make use of the weak air conditioning while I could, or hop out and walk in a random direction in hopes of finding help, though who knew how far away that might be. In the end, I chose the former. I was stuck out there for 20 hours before a helicopter overhead just so happened to spot my van, stranded in the middle of the outback. I was unconscious when the rescuers found me. I was later told how lucky I was. Drinking my water quickly instead of sipping it, not exerting myself, and making use of the AC are what likely saved me. Well, that and pure luck. After leaving the hospital, I was on the next flight home, but made sure to give a full and detailed description of the two blokes that did this to me. Even so, to my knowledge, Jacko and Dave were never found. I often wonder if they ever did this to anyone else. Doesn't seem like the kind of thing you'd just do once. The way they were laughing and taunting me, it was clear they had a taste for it. Whenever I read about people losing their lives in the outback, I think back to that encounter and wonder if Dave and Jacko had something to do with it.
In 2006, my husband and I bought our first home. We had a 6-month-old girl and soon found we were expecting our son. We loved the cute, all-brick ranch home in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing seemed strange at first. But as I began preparing the guest room at the back of the house to become a nursery, I felt something. I remember scraping the old wallpaper border off the walls and feeling a tightness in the room. The energy in there was so different than the rest of the house. I'd never experienced that before, and I wasn't really into the paranormal at the time. But I knew something felt off. Fast forward to 2005. My son was born, and it was such a happy time. He was not a good sleeper and had tummy problems. No big deal, no alarms going off. Then, when he was about 4 or 5, things changed. I don't remember where my husband was, but he was not home that night. I was watching TV, when all of a sudden my little boy came running down the hall in tears, shaking violently. I asked him what was wrong. He looked at me and told me his bed wouldn't stop shaking. I was terrified, and it brought back my feelings of severe discomfort in that room. I had him sleep with me that night, and that was not a common thing for us. After that, other little things happened. Things most people would not notice. Our cat would sit at the end of the hall, intently gazing toward the room with eyes wide. We'd take cute pictures of our kids playing in the small room, and there would always be strange orbs and mists. No solid proof, but still puzzling. I would also see shadows move quickly in the basement. I actually refused to sit on one side of the couch because the view of the hall was too clear, and I was afraid I would see the shadow again. But the scariest thing that happened to me in that home happened when my son was about 8. His room had a large window that was illuminated by a streetlight at the end of our driveway. I would still tuck him in at bedtime, and that night I kissed him goodnight and then turned around to leave. As soon as I turned, I saw a black figure about 6 feet tall. I could see it due to the light, but not through it. I was so scared. I just blinked a couple times, walked right around it, and left the room. People question why I left my son in there, and I understand that. But by that point, he'd been living in that room for 8 years. he'd never been hurt or assaulted. In 2016, we decided to move to a bigger home for our kids. Our realtor took pictures as they always do. Needless to say, there were some interesting photos. My favorite relates to the cat. When I worked the night shift, I would stay up on my nights off and watch TV. Our cat would always stare at the cushion next to me, and I could not grab his attention away from that spot. In the photo of the living room, there was a white ball of light hanging right over the middle of the cushion, right where he would stare. It was incredible. The house sold quickly. As far as I know, the new owner hasn't had any activity. I still, at times, feel like there's something with me, but I haven't had any experiences similar to that old house. My son still feels as though he knows spirits are present, and he is now almost 16. He really doesn't like to talk about it, but my daughter and I still recall how uncomfortable his room was.
I was driving home with a friend from a tournament we had gone to about 2 or 3 hours away. The whole weekend, it had been raining and storming very hard, and a lot of roads were flooded. This was Indiana, so a bunch of side roads and bridges were just gone. We had to reroute around 231, since a huge section of it was underwater from where a river had flooded. We ended up going through a few side towns and back roads that were a lot higher elevation away from other bodies of water. We were driving through one small town, and I was navigating with the GPS in the car. I would glance at it every once in a while, but I was also paying attention to what was going on outside the car, as it was raining pretty heavily still. The GPS directed us on a road that connected up with a more main one, and we were driving on it just fine, when suddenly, my buddy slams on the brakes that were in the middle of a graveyard, and the road just ends. I look down at the GPS, and then show my buddy that the road continues straight on and straight back the way we came according to the GPS screen. He shrugs, turns around, and then we start back the way we came. Now, we had been telling ghost stories, and I was not at all sleepy or tired. We had driven on the one road the last 15 miles or so, directly through the town, and on into the countryside before we encountered the graveyard. On the way back, we made 5 or 6 turns within this graveyard through which we had just come on a straight road that also suddenly spanned back a mile or so, before finally getting back onto the straight road we thought we were on before. I looked at the GPS again, and it was rerouting. When it finished, the route it wanted us to take was make a U-turn and continue straight for 10 miles. We both turned around in our seats to confirm that we had indeed just driven through a huge graveyard, with many turns and twists in the road leading back into it. Instead, we saw the road dead-ended into a small graveyard that we immediately drove back to the town the opposite direction of the graveyard and took a different route home.
My ghost story goes back to when I lived about 45 minutes northwest of Chicago in a town called Mundelein in Illinois. Now, at the time, I was married and I had 3 small children. They were 2, 3, and 4. And my dad at the time was sick. He was sick with cancer. So when he finally passed, it was in July. And let me say that before my dad passed, he, for whatever reason, did not like my then-time husband, now ex-husband. Apparently, he knew something I didn't, but he always used to poke at him and always contradict everything he said, and he made it very, very clear that he didn't like my ex-husband. So, like I said, it was July, and he passed away. And the night after he passed away, we were asleep, and my husband and I used to sleep in our bedroom with the door closed, never locked. And my 3 kids were very close. They used to sleep in the same room and more often than not in the same bed together. So it's the night after he passed away. It's about 2:30, 3 in the morning. And I'm woke out of this sound sleep to hear my doorknob, my bedroom doorknob that leads out into the hallway, jingling. And I looked over at it, and it looked like it was twisting back and forth, like maybe one of the kids was out in the hallway and trying to open the door or whatever. So I yelled, "Open the door, come in." And I waited, and the doorknob still jingled, and I could still see it moving, left to right, like somebody was turning it this way and that way. So I yelled out a second time, "Come on in." Same thing. The doorknob just continued to make noise and move back and forth. So I got out of bed. I was a little upset that they wouldn't open the door and come right in. So I walked over to the door. I grabbed the doorknob. I flung the door open, and there was no one in the hallway. The hallway was completely empty. At the time, we didn't have any animals. It was just my husband, myself, and my 3 kids. So I thought, well, maybe they got mad when I was yelling at them to come into the room and they went back in their room. So I walked over to the room that they were sleeping in, and they were all sound asleep. You could tell that they had been asleep for a very long time. They weren't faking it. So then I started to get a little nervous and a little bit scared. So I checked out the rest of the house. Everything was fine. Everything was in order. The doors were locked. The windows were closed. So I finally was able to fall back asleep. I got up in the morning, and it was a weekday. And the way that usually played out was I would get up and shower first. Then my husband would get in the shower while I got my kids ready, and then took them to the babysitter and went to work. So I got up, I showered, maybe 10 minutes at the most in the shower. I got out and started getting the kids ready. My husband got in the shower, and just like a minute after he got in the shower, he came back out. And I thought that was weird. And he was all wet, and he said, "Did you have hot water when you showered?" And I said, "Well, yeah, of course I had hot water when I showered. Why?" And he said he got in the shower, the water was nice and warm, and then after like 30 seconds or so, it went ice cold. It wasn't like I had used too much hot water and it started out warm and got a little cooler and a little cooler and got cold. It was straight up, it went from nice and warm to ice cold in just like the snap of a finger. We didn't know what to do, so we went down. We thought we'd look at the water heater and make sure the pilot light's lit. And our water heater was in a little pantry that was like next to the hallway in our kitchen. It was just like a little utility closet, and it had the furnace and the hot water heater in there. And we looked at the pilot light in the hot water heater, and it was lit. So my husband said, "You know what? There's a shut-off valve at the very top of the water heater." Sorry, that's my bird. He wants to get his 2 cents in. He's like, "Let's check the shut-off at the top of the water heater." So my husband, an adult person, stands on the chair, and he's able to reach on the very top. There's no way the kids could have reached it because they're too little. Even if they stood on a chair, it wouldn't be tall enough. But the shut-off valve at the top of the water heater was not only shut off, it was like one of those little round candles you have like on an outside fixture for your hose. It was a round little thing like that. And not only was it turned closed, it was turned closed so tight, I'm really sorry about the bird, that he had to put a wrench in between the little spokes in the round thing to turn it on and off, the handle. He had to put a wrench in the handle and literally force it open. It was closed so tight. There's just no way that you could have done that, and especially with how quickly it happened. So, my husband opened it back up, went up tried the shower. Water was instantly hot again. So we thought about it, and I told him, I said, honey, the only thing I can come up with is, my dad never liked you. And I told him about the weird stuff that happened the night before. I said, I think my dad was just coming to say goodbye to me last night and letting you know this morning that his feelings for you are still the same. I don't know. It was one of those really, really weird things. Anyways, maybe it was something else. Maybe there's an explanation we couldn't figure out, but I still like to think it was my dad coming to at least say goodbye.
In 7th grade, my friends and I went over to a friend's house to play with her mom's Ouija board that night. None of us had played with one before. Mary's mom was an extremely spiritual person who believed in energies, witchcraft, stuff like that. Before we used the board, Mary warned us that her mom would be really pissed if she found out that we were playing with it because Ouija boards can attract bad spirits into the home. With full knowledge of this, we decided to proceed anyway. This Ouija board was not like the average Ouija board you had ever seen. Along with the usual characteristics such as the alphabet, yes, no, goodbye, there was an entire array of symbols and signs that were all arranged in a circle. This was some seriously intricate stuff that we started just goofing around and communicating with random spirits here and there until we finally met one that had us in tears the entire sleepless night. First, we asked the spirit if it was a man or a woman, to which he replied, man. Then we asked how he was killed, murder. That freaked us out only a little bit, but we were mostly excited. All of a sudden, before we even asked another question, the glass goes to the eyeball symbol, then spells out IN, and goes to the water symbol. We didn't have a clue what that meant. It wasn't too scary until the spirit spelled out shower, and my best friend realized that the spirit was trying to get us to look into the shower. We froze. I've never been so scared in my entire life, especially sitting directly in front of the bathroom with the shower curtain all the way closed, faced in my direction. We all screamed and promised on our friendships that we had not moved it ourselves, very important promise. I felt like I was being watched and my friends thought so too. It was only 4 of us and I believe with all my heart that none of them had moved it because we were all too nervous to do anything. I'll never use a Ouija board again because of how crazy and intense that night was. I know I felt something in that room with us. I know it was something dangerous.
I live in a small town. Like, you blink and you'll miss it. The best we can boast is that we have a single stop sign and a gas station, which we only have because of the nearby highway. Any actual semblance of a town is almost half an hour away. So when things get scary out here, it's amplified. The occasional homeless person is no big deal. They're often drifting through. Drug addicts run rampant and will steal everything they can from your house. But it's the normal out here. However, what happened a few years back certainly wasn't normal. Originally, I was dead asleep in my bed. I only woke up because it was burning hot in my room. It was summertime, and there wasn't much I could do about that. I just remember tossing and turning until I got a creepy feeling that fell into the pit of my stomach. I glanced over to the bathroom door that was open with the light on. Everything was normal. I left the light on so I wouldn't trip and die if I had to pee in the middle of the night. But next, I glanced at the window directly across from my bed. I had no curtains, but I did have a set of blinds. Part of the blinds had been broken from wear and tear, and the crappy AC output beneath it would make them move back and forth so you'd get a glimpse outside every so often. The yard light was still going, but what made me stop was the outline outside of my window. The figure of someone directly beyond my window pane, almost like it was waiting for the blinds to move to watch me. I didn't have an imagination as a child. That had been trained out of me. But the sight was enough to pour every horror film into my head at that very moment. I squeezed my eyes shut and pulled my blankets over my head and slept in a cloth oven that night, By morning time, the figure was gone. I remember running to my mom's room on the verge of tears in the morning, telling her what had happened. She laughed at me like I was an idiot, told me that it was probably just a stray cat that had climbed up there for one odd reason or another. I almost believed her, since my window was pretty high off the ground, but something just didn't sit right with me. Later that day, when we were doing yard work, I glanced over at my window and saw one of our metal patio chairs had been pushed up to it. I pointed it out to my mom, who proceeded to chew me out. That's how the cat probably got up there, moron. Stop leaving furniture everywhere. But I hadn't moved it. It was heavy enough that I struggled with it. So we moved it back, and so began a pattern. At night, I'd see the figure, complain to my mom, and we'd find a chair moved back every single morning. And this went on for a few weeks. My mother stopped caring about my concerns until one morning we saw where the outside screen of my window had been sliced open. I still remember her shaking her head and complaining about those damn stray cats, the ones that we had still yet to see. I could tell she was unnerved by the development. I couldn't handle it anymore, and I opted to sleep in our living room that night. The only problem was our kitchen and living room connected, which meant there were always several windows. The first night of my move went well, despite my back hurting from the couch. I avoided my room like the plague. It wasn't until about 4 days later that we ran into an issue. I woke up and glanced at the clock above the fireplace. It read a little past 3 a.m. I couldn't realize why I'd woken up until it happened again. There was a beam of light shining in from the kitchen window, almost as if someone was shining a flashlight through. I saw it trace along the walls and land on the love seat across from the couch that I was on. I was absolutely mortified. When I told my mom, she continued to laugh at me. I gave in and decided that I would sleep in my dad's room, even though it had a gigantic window in it. He slept in the recliner with a huge TV, so I felt more safe having someone around. The yard light was directly outside the window anyway, so it seemed foolproof. That was until I woke up out of habitual fear and watched through the window across from the bed. Everything seemed normal as time drug on, and I felt like a moron. Maybe my mom was right. That was until I saw a lone figure come out of the woods by the backyard shed, walk directly under the light, and head to the patio furniture like he'd been here plenty of times before. I still remember the large build the man had, and the confidence like he was the one who lived here and wasn't creeping around my yard in the dead of night. I just remember listening to the TV until I fell asleep again, hoping to get another glimpse. My dad would have been pissed if I had woken him up. He was grumpy on a good day, terrifying on a bad. I didn't feel like risking it unless I had solid proof because of just how scared I was. The next morning, my mom chewed me out again for the patio furniture, which was pretty much routine by this point. Although this time, something new happened. She demanded I stop playing in the toolboxes of the garage. A bunch of tools had been taken out and left on our doorstep. Screwdrivers, a large hammer, flashlight. But it wasn't me. I begged with my mom, pleaded with her, just stay up with me one night. We couldn't close our garage because it was an open carport, and I wasn't going to get my ass beaten for touching tools because of someone else. It was driving me mad. Finally, she agreed. That night, we would stay awake in the living room. I finally fell asleep before my mom, but I remember her waking me up in a panic. She pointed to the window that overlooked into our garage. We could see the top of someone's head as they walked back and forth. There was the sound of someone placing metal tools down on brick steps, as if they were trying to be quiet, but couldn't fully muffle it. She whispered for me to go wake my dad. My dad was angry, having been woken up in the middle of the night by his frantic daughter. He grabbed his pistol and headed out the back door, towards the front of the house where the garage was located. We heard my dad screaming and someone dropping tools. Then, the sound of a gunshot, twice. Crazed footsteps pounding around the garage, and they felt as if they were coming directly from my chest. My mom peeked out the window and then opened the door, just as my dad stumbled in. He had missed both shots because of his unstable aim, but told us that there was a man crouching at our front door, looking at our door handle. None of us slept that night, and in the morning, we phoned the police from the nearest town. They didn't do much besides ask if anything had been stolen, asked for a description of the man, and then told us to install cameras. But that was it. They said that whoever the guy was probably was just looking for something easy to steal for quick money. If that had been the case, why hadn't he stolen the tools, the generator, the welder, or broken into any of the vehicles just sitting in our garage? We finally set up hunting trail cameras around the house, but nothing has happened since. Coming home from college for holidays, I still have nightmares about this, even years later, when I sleep in my own bed. I don't know what he was looking for, or why he did the things that he was doing. But whatever the case may be, man at the window.
And here's a story from Brooklyn, New York. John Yates was a popular figure around Brooklyn City Hall. He was broad-shouldered, stood over 6 feet tall, had a striking personality, and as a result of the severe attack of smallpox about 18 years prior, he had a disfigured face and loss of one eye. Although everyone knew of him, nobody knew very much about his background, except that he was from England, he had a sister over there, and he was over 60 years old. John had worked at the local press for over 25 years. He would work from very early morning until late at night. He would spend his mornings before work reading the newspaper at a restaurant where they saved a seat for him each day. In 1889, John was renting a room in a 3-story brick home at 39 Green Avenue in Brooklyn, New York, at the corner of Carlton. That home is no longer there, as it was replaced by a several-story brick apartment building in 1900. At the Green Avenue home, he lived with a few others. The housekeeper, a religious healer named Fanny Ann Silsby, and one other tenant. John Yates was a very private man, but one of his daily habits that the other tenants were familiar with was that every morning at 5 a.m. he would take a bath. On Sunday, December 23rd, Mr. Yates had been out doing errands, but returned home by 3 p.m. One of his friends later said that John told him he wasn't feeling well. This struck his friend as odd because he was always doing well and didn't complain about his health. The following morning, December 24th, 1888, the other tenants noticed that John didn't take his daily bath. Concerned, they knocked on his door. No answer. They tried to open the door and it was locked from the inside. Fearing something was wrong, the tenants contacted the police. The police broke into the room and found John Yates fully dressed and lying face down in his bed. The bedding hadn't been disturbed. He was dead, and it was believed he died of a stroke when he got home at 3 p.m. Sunday. Newspapers in Brooklyn, New York, displayed their sadness with the loss of the very popular John Yates, with lengthy obituaries that gave a background on his popularity and what he meant to the news organizations, as well as what he meant to the Brooklyn area. A few weeks had passed since the discovery of John Yates' dead body in his bedroom, and his room remained unrented. As stated earlier, another of the tenants at the 39 Green Avenue home was Fanny Silsby. She worked as a religious healer. She had several clients in the area as well as out of town. One afternoon, Fanny was getting ready to leave for an out-of-town appointment. A real estate professional, William Kaufman, who had been having sleep difficulties, knocked on the door. Kaufman had been a no-show for a previous session with Fanny, so Fanny was a little upset, and bluntly told him he would have to come back at another time. Fanny left the home in a hurry, and left Kaufman in the house, putting on his rubber footwear for the inclement weather. A housekeeper was at the home at the time. Being a real estate professional, Kaufman decided to take a look around the home before leaving. When Fanny returned from her appointment, she went up to her room and noticed that a very expensive gold watch that she had left on her dresser was missing. After talking to the housekeeper, she processed her day and began to believe that Kaufman had stolen the watch. Also because the housekeeper said she saw Kaufman wandering around the home before he left. Fanny went to go speak to Mr. Kaufman and accused him of stealing her watch. But he emphatically denied taking or knowing anything about her missing watch, and was insulted by the accusation. A few days later, Fanny found something strange in the home. In one of the empty rooms, she found an empty tin box, a bottle of morphine, and half-burned candlestick. She reported this to the police. The police came to the Green Avenue home and made a thorough search. They found nothing. But as the police were searching a large closet in the basement, they heard strange noises and pounding on the walls. The noises sounded like something smashing glass, and the sound was so loud that it disturbed the occupants of the adjoining house. They could find no explanation for the noises. So the two officers decided at that point to remain in the home overnight. Around midnight, two officers were joined by a sergeant and a telegraph officer. During the night, all four of these professionals heard mysterious noises and knocks on the wall, and as such they decided to stay the following night. By Saturday morning, in despair, the police gave up on their search. The sergeant said at one point of the stay they were seen in the basement, and they could hear pieces of coal rattling against the walls of the cellar. As soon as they hurried down into the cellar, they found everything in its place and still as a grave. There was no evidence of coal being thrown out. These stories of knocks on the walls, Fanny's watch going missing, and strange sounds started rumors that the ghost of the recently dead John Yates was haunting the home where he had died so suddenly at 39 Green Avenue. In the coming days, the mysterious sounds the police witnessed continued, as well as loud footsteps and laughter. But as suddenly as it all started, it all stopped within a couple of weeks.
A few years ago, I used to work in hospitality so I could travel and earn money while I did it. I was working in a beautiful hotel in Peru. One day, I was working in reception. I was checking people into their rooms, and this one lady walks in. She had long brown hair, a black handbag, and a red shirt with what looked like weird stains on it. She had booked a room with 4 bedrooms. I thought it was a bit odd that she'd booked one of the biggest rooms and she's just one person, but I just assumed the other people were going to come in later. She was also only going to stay for 2 nights. I gave her the keys and didn't see her for a while after that. The next day, everything was normal, but it was at night when things started to get weird. I got a phone call on my hotel's phone at around 10 p.m., and at the same time my personal phone started ringing. My phone said, "No caller ID," so I ignored it and hanged up, so I could pick up my work phone. I picked up. It was the same lady I saw earlier. She was crying, saying she needed the ambulance. I asked why, and she wouldn't stop weeping. She just kept begging me to call the ambulance. So I did, and luckily, the hotel was only about a block away from a hospital. The ambulance quickly came and we went into her room, where I will never forget what I saw. There was blood everywhere, absolutely everywhere. But that lady wasn't there. It was only blood. I got freaked out. I couldn't handle seeing the blood, so I went back to the desk downstairs, and on my desk I found an odd printed note. The note said, "You'll need it later." Next to the note was a small clay bowl. Later, I told my Peruvian friend about it, and she said they use clay bowls as a source of protection from malevolent spirits. A few years later, and I still have dreams about this lady all the time. I had a dream where I would see her again in a hotel room, and she would just be standing, staring at me. It wasn't until I started working in another hotel where I saw her in the lobby. She looked the exact same. Her red shirt was clean this time. I was petrified. She was smiling just like in my dream. I screamed, and my colleague at the time ran over to me and asked what was wrong. I told her about the lady, and she said no one was there. This story is completely real. There was a large police investigation surrounding the case, but I never found out much about it. I was questioned a few times as a witness. I would ask the authorities lots of questions, but most of them went unanswered. They tested the blood and DNA, such as fingerprints and hair strands in the room, and it was the lady's. They also found her identity. And yes, the blood was hers.